My name is Abby. I am 21 years old, a third-year sociology student at the Madrid Institute of Critical Social Sciences, and a barista at a third-wave coffee collective called The Ethical Bean in the heart of Malesana. I do not see my life as a series of random events, but rather as a sequence of political interactions, a continuous laboratory where the dynamics of power, gender, and capital collide in the most mundane ways. Every morning, as I steam oat milk to the precise temperature of 65 degrees Celsius, I am not just making coffee, I am observing the wreckage of the patriarchy as it stumbles through the door, half awake and demanding caffeine. The cafe is my primary field site. I treat the counter as a barrier between the enlightened and the unconscious. To the average observer, a man sitting with his legs wide across two chairs is just a tired commuter. To me, it is manspreading, a physical manifestation of territorial aggression and an unearned claim to public space. I keep a digital journal, a daily patriarchy report, where I document these microaggressions. Last Tuesday, for instance, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit tried to explain the origin of our Ethiopian blend to me, despite the fact that I wrote the pedagogical placards hanging behind him. I didn't just correct him, I dismantled him. I used terms like epistemic arrogance and unconscious bias until his face turned the color of a light roast and he hurried out without his change. I didn't need his change. I needed his realization, though I knew his ego would likely prevent it from taking root. This commitment to ethical purity is not a hobby, it is my armor. I have read the radical theories of the 20th century and the intro manifestos of the 21st. I understand that nothing is neutral. A smile can be a tool of subservience. A thank you can be a condescending dismissal. I calculate the emotional labor of every interaction. If I spend 10 minutes listening to a male friend complain about his career, I expect an equivalent transfer of intellectual or social capital in return. Relationships are not mystical bonds, they are ledgers of effort and equity. It was against this backdrop of rigorous self-audit that the news of my grandfather's death arrived. Alejandro was a man of the old world, a relic of a time when the paterfamilias held absolute authority. He owned a significant estate on the outskirts of Madrid, a sprawling villa and several hectares of land that had been in the family for generations. My brothers, Mateo and Lucas, viewed this through the lens of traditional mourning. Mateo, a civil engineer who builds the physical infrastructure of the status quo, and Lucas, a junior analyst at a private investment firm, immediately began talking about fair shares. To them, fair meant a three-way split. To me, the concept of a three-way split was a reinforcement of systemic inequity. I saw the inheritance not as a windfall, but as a site of historical reparation. I remember the first meeting we had at the villa, La Quinta de la Memoria, a name I found nauseatingly nostalgic. The air was thick with the scent of old dust and expensive cedar. Mateo was leaning against the mahogany desk in the study, his very presence an exercise in dominant posturing. Lucas was checking his watch, calculating the market value of the land before the body was even cold. "It's simple," Mateo said, his voice echoing with the unearned confidence of the firstborn. "The will is clear. 1/3 each. We sell the land, renovate the villa, and split the proceeds. It's what grandfather wanted." I sat across from them, my notebook open, my pen poised like a scalpel. I didn't look at the faded family photos on the wall. I looked at the structural imbalance in the room. Grandfather's wishes are a product of a defunct moral framework, I said, my tone clinical and detached. You both have spent your lives benefiting from the patriarchal dividend. Mateo, your education was prioritized because you were there. Lucas, you were given the social connections that landed you in finance. I, on the other hand, have had to navigate a world designed to impede my progress. My labor, both academic and domestic, has been undervalued. A simple split is not equality, it is the continuation of a historical theft. Lucas laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. Abby, this isn't a sociology seminar. It's a legal document. We're talking about property, not your thesis. Property is the thesis, Lucas, I replied, feeling the familiar heat of intellectual superiority rising in my chest. You see the world in stagnant blocks of mine and yours. I see the flows of privilege that allowed those blocks to accumulate in your hands. I am proposing a radical redistribution. I am claiming 60% of the estate. The remaining 40 can be split between you two. Consider it a tax on your historical advantages. The silence that followed was satisfying. They looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, which, in a way, I was. I was speaking the language of justice in a house built on tradition. They didn't understand that I wasn't just asking for money, I was conducting a forensic audit of our entire family history. I thought of our mother, who had spent her life as a support system for my grandfather's ambitions, her own potential withered in the shade of his ego. I was her proxy now. I was the one who would finally balance the books. The conflict escalated rapidly. Within a week, I had stopped taking their calls. Every message they sent was analyzed for gaslighting or emotional manipulation. When Mateo sent a text saying, "Abby, please be reasonable, we're family," I took a screenshot and sent it to my group chat of fellow activists. Note the appeal to reason, I wrote. A classic tactic to delegitimize the emotional and political claims of the marginalized by framing them as irrational. I sought legal counsel not from a traditional firm, but from a boutique practice called Equitable Justice Associates. My lawyer, Beatriz, was a woman who understood that the law was a patriarchal construct that could be hacked from the inside. We spent hours in her glass-walled office overlooking the Gran Via, constructing a case that relied on a radical interpretation of uncompensated care work and educational disparity. We argued that my grandfather had made verbal promises to me that were grounded in a recognition of my unique struggles as a woman in a male-dominated academic field, a social contract that superseded the written will. Of course, the promises were mostly my own interpretation of his occasional moments of guilt, but in the theater of the courtroom, narrative is everything. I was prepared to be the protagonist in a drama of liberation. The trial took place in a sterile building that smelled of floor wax and bureaucracy. My brothers appeared in suits, looking like the very embodiment of the institutions I sought to dismantle. I wore a simple black turtleneck and carried a worn copy of a book on feminist economics. I wanted to look like the future staring down the past. The proceedings were grueling. My brother's lawyer, a man who seemed to have stepped out of a 1950s boardroom, tried to paint me as a disgruntled, entitled student who was weaponizing terminology to hide a simple act of greed. I sat in the witness stand, my spine straight, and refused to be intimidated. "Is it true, Miss Abby," the lawyer asked, "that you had almost no contact with your grandfather in the last 3 years of his life?" I maintained a boundary, I corrected him. His house was a space where my identity was constantly negated. To enter it was to perform a version of myself that was palatable to his antiquated worldviews. My absence was an act of political protest, not a lack of care. My care was expressed through the intellectual labor I performed to understand the systems that kept him, and by extension, my brothers, trapped in a cycle of dominance. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, watched me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. I chose to believe it was respect. As the weeks dragged on, the rift in my family became an abyss. My mother called me, crying, begging me to drop the suit. "Abby, you're tearing us a," she sobbed. "It's just a house. Don't lose your brothers over this." "It's not just a house, Mother," I said, my voice steady despite the slight tremor in my hands. "It's a symbol. And if you feel torn, it's because you are still identifying with the system that suppressed you. I am doing this for you, too, even if you're too conditioned to see it." She hung up on me. I recorded the call as evidence of internalized oppression. In my social circle, I was a hero. At the cafe, my regular customers, the ones I deemed conscious, would ask for updates. I was the girl who was suing the patriarchy. I was the one who wouldn't settle for fair when just was on the table. I felt a surge of power every time I posted an update on social media. My follower count grew. I was becoming an icon of the ethical purity movement. I was the person who lived her theory, no matter the cost. But the cost was starting to manifest in ways I hadn't predicted. It wasn't just my family. I began to apply the same rigorous auditing to my friends. One evening, my friend Sophia, who had been my closest confidant since our first semester, dared to suggest that I might be being a bit harsh on Lucas. "He's just a kid, Abby," she said over drinks. "He's 23 and he's terrified of losing his sister. Maybe you could just talk to him without the jargon." I looked at her, the ice in my drink clinking against the glass. I felt a coldness settle over me. "Sophia," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "I didn't realize you were an apologist for male fragility. By prioritizing his terror over my systemic claim, you are actively participating in my silencing. Is this the kind of friendship you offer? One that requires me to shrink so a man can feel comfortable?" "Abby, that's not what I meant." "I know exactly what you meant," I interrupted. "It's disappointing. I thought you were more evolved. I can't have people in my inner circle who act as buffers for the patriarchy. It's a matter of ethical hygiene." I blocked her before I even left the bar. It was a clean break. Efficient. Necessary. The purity of my mission required a sterile environment. The climax of the legal battle came on a rainy Tuesday in November. The judge was ready to deliver her verdict. I sat at the plaintiff's table, Beatrice beside me, feeling like I was on the verge of a historic victory. Across the aisle, Mateo and Lucas looked exhausted. They didn't even look at me. There was no anger left in their eyes, only a profound, hollow sadness. I interpreted this as the defeat of the dominant narrative. The judge began to speak. She acknowledged the complexities of the case and the unusual sociological arguments presented by the plaintiff. To my shock and to the visible horror of my brothers, she ruled immediately in my favor. Due to a technicality in the way the land was titled and a specific clause in regional Madrid law concerning equitable distribution among heirs with disparate economic trajectories, she granted me 55% of the total estate. It wasn't the 60 I had demanded, but it was a majority. It was a win. I walked out of the courtroom into the gray Madrid rain, feeling like I had ascended to a higher plane of existence. I had done it. I had forced the law to recognize the invisible debts of the past. "Abby," Mateo called out as I reached the sidewalk. I turned, my umbrella held like a shield. He was standing there, his coat unbuttoned, looking older than his years. "You won. I hope the money is worth it. Because Lucas is moving to London and I'm done. We're selling our shares to a developer tomorrow. Don't call us. Don't come to Christmas. We don't have a sister anymore. We just have a creditor." He turned and walked away before I could respond with a critique of his emotional blackmail. I watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling a strange, fleeting pang in my chest. I dismissed it as a residual symptom of my upbringing, a phantom limb of a social structure I had successfully amputated. In the weeks that followed, the victory felt quiet. I moved into the villa. It was far too large for one person, but I saw it as my autonomous zone. I spent thousands of euros, my inheritance, renovating it to be perfectly ethical. I installed solar panels from a fair trade manufacturer, replaced all the colonial, mahogany furniture with sustainable bamboo, and filled the library with radical literature. I hired a cleaning service, but I insisted on paying them 3 times the market rate and providing them with a power dynamics agreement that they had to sign before entering. They looked at me with confusion, signed the papers, and worked in silence. I quit my job at the coffee shop. I didn't need the money anymore, and I found that my daily patriarchy reports were becoming repetitive. Besides, the new manager had the audacity to suggest that I should smile more at the customers, a microaggression so blatant that it didn't even require a report, it required a resignation. I was now a full-time socio-ethical observer. I spent my days in the villa, writing my thesis and posting to my followers. But a strange thing happened. As my environment became more pure, the number of people who could exist within it dwindled to 0. I tried to host a communal dialogue at the villa, inviting the people from my university. Only 3 showed up. We sat in the bamboo-furnished living room, drinking organic tea. I found myself correcting them constantly. One used the word crazy ableist language. Another mentioned her boyfriend in a way that centered heteronormativity. By the end of the hour, they were looking at their phones, eager to leave. I realized then that they weren't radical enough for me. They were still stained by the world outside. They were compromised. By December, The villa was a fortress of ideological perfection. Everything in it was ethically sourced, politically correct, and utterly silent. The crisis came on a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday. I was on a ladder in the library, trying to reach a high shelf of books on decolonial theory, when the ladder slipped. It was a sustainable ladder, but apparently, its structural integrity hadn't been as rigorously audited as its carbon footprint. I fell hard. My ankle twisted with a sickening pop, and I hit my head against the edge of the bamboo table. For a moment, the world went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, the silence of the villa pressing down on me like a weight. My ankle was throbbing, already swelling to twice its size. I tried to stand, but a sharp, white-hot pain shot through my leg, and I collapsed back onto the floor. I reached for my phone. My first instinct was to call Matteo. He was an engineer. He knew about first aid. He was strong. He would know what to do. My thumb hovered over his name in my contacts. Then I remembered. He was a systemic enemy. I had sued him. I had told him his love was a form of control. I looked at Lucas's name. He was in London. He had called me a creditor. I looked at Sophia's name. I had blocked her for mail apology. I realized, with a clarity that was sharper than the pain in my ankle, that there was no one to call. I had audited my life so thoroughly that I had removed every person who didn't meet my standards of purity. And the problem with human beings is that they are inherently messy, inconsistent, and unpure. By demanding a world where everyone was a perfect political actor, I had ended up in a world where I was the only actor left. I lay there for 2 hours, the light in the library fading as the sun set over the Sierra de Guadarrama. The autonomous zone I had created felt less like a liberated space and more like a high-end prison. The solar-powered lights flickered on, illuminating the rows of books that told me how to dismantle the world, but not how to fix a broken ankle or how to endure a night alone. Eventually, I managed to crawl to the kitchen and call an ambulance. The paramedics were men. In any other circumstance, I would have analyzed their savior complex or the way they handled my body without explicit consent narratives at every step. But as they lifted me onto the stretcher, I found myself gripping the arm of one of them, a young man with tired eyes who looked remarkably like Matteo. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded, a simple, human gesture. "It's okay, miss. We've got you." When I returned from the hospital, the villa felt even larger and colder. I sat in my wheelchair in the center of the living room, surrounded by my ethically sourced possessions. I had won the inheritance. I had the majority share. I had the intellectual high ground. I had the purity I had always craved. I opened my laptop to post an update. I started to type. The fragility of the physical body is a reminder of the precariousness of the marginalized. I stopped. I looked at the cursor blinking on the screen. It looked like a heartbeat. Or a countdown. I looked at the photos of my brothers I had moved to the attic. I thought about calling them, but what would I say? I was wrong. To say I was wrong would be to admit that my entire theoretical framework had a fatal flaw. It would mean admitting that human relationships require a gray area, a space for error, for unironic affection, and for the kind of unearned loyalty that doesn't fit into a ledger of emotional labor. I couldn't do it. My identity was too tied to my purity. If I wasn't the radical ethical auditor, who was I? Just a lonely 21-year-old girl in a house she didn't need, with a family she had traded for a point of law. I deleted the text. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark, the only sound the humming of the high-efficiency refrigerator. I had reached the end of the theory. I had followed the logic to its ultimate conclusion. The world was finally clean. There were no microaggressions here. No manspreading. No patriarchal dividends. No toxic influences. There was just me, Abby, 21, alone in the perfect silence of my own making. I had won the war, and in the process, I had inherited a wasteland. As the days turned into weeks, my ankle healed, but the silence in the villa only deepened. I tried to return to my studies, but the words on the page felt like ash. I would read about community building and radical solidarity, and then I would look at my call log, which contained nothing but the pharmacy and the grocery delivery service. I had become a ghost in my own utopia. One afternoon, I walked out to the edge of the property, leaning on a cane. The land was beautiful, the rolling hills of Madrid stretching out toward the horizon. This was the land my grandfather had worked, the land my brothers had wanted to preserve. Now, half of it was being surveyed by the developers Mateo had sold his share to. They were going to build a luxury-gated community. I stood at the fence line and watched the surveyors. They were men in orange vests, shouting to each other, laughing, sharing thermoses of coffee. They were unconscious, privileged, and systemic cogs. But they were together. I felt a sudden, violent urge to scream, to break the ethical hygiene of my life with something raw and ugly. I wanted to run into the field and tell them that I was Abby, and I was right, and that my majority share was a victory for women everywhere. But the words stayed in my throat. I knew how they would look at me. They wouldn't see an ethical icon. They would see a woman standing alone on a hill, clutching a cane, guarding a house that had no life in it. I turned back toward the villa. The bamboo furniture was waiting. The radical library was waiting. The power dynamics agreements were filed neatly in a drawer. I entered the house and locked the door. I checked the security system, a state-of-the-art setup that kept the world out. I sat at the mahogany desk, the one piece of furniture I hadn't been able to bring myself to replace, and opened my journal. I didn't write a patriarchy report. I didn't analyze a microaggression. I just wrote one sentence over and over again, until the ink ran dry. The price of purity is the absence of people. I am Abby. I am 21 years old. I am an expert in the sociology of power. And I have never been more powerful or more utterly, irrevocably alone. The sun went down, and the house transitioned to its battery power. The silent, green energy hummed through the walls. I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, the only light in the Quinta de la Memoria. I scrolled through the social media profiles of my brothers. Mateo had a new girlfriend. They were laughing in a photo taken in a crowded, problematic tapas bar. Lucas was in a pub in London, surrounded by friends, holding a pint of beer that was almost certainly not fair trade. They looked happy. They looked compromised. They looked like they were living in the wreckage of the world, while I was reigning over the ruins of my own ideals. I reached for my phone and unblocked Sophia. I started to type a message. I'm sorry. I stopped. I couldn't finish it. To say I was wrong would be to dismantle the only version of myself I knew how to be. I deleted the draft. I put the phone down and looked out at the dark hills. The wind howled through the eaves of the old house, a sound that no amount of renovation could silence. It was the sound of the past, calling out to a future that had no room for it. I pulled my ethical, organic cotton blanket around my shoulders and prepared for another night of perfect, principled isolation. This was what I had fought for. This was the redistribution of wealth. This was the end of the patriarchy in my own small corner of the world. And as the tears finally began to fall, I made sure to note the emotional labor I was performing for myself. I was the auditor, the observer, and the prisoner. And the books, for the first time in my life, were finally balanced. The silence of the villa was absolute, a vacuum where the perfect Abby lived. I had reached the purity spiral's end, and found that at the very center of it, there was nothing but the cold, clear light of an empty room. I had proven my point. I had won the case. I had secured the inheritance. I was the mistress of all I surveyed, and I had never been smaller. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of a car driving away, someone heading back to the city, back to the messy world of Madrid, where people made mistakes, used the wrong words, and loved each other without a theoretical framework. I stood by the window and watched the taillights disappear into the dark, feeling like a sailor on a deserted island watching a ship pass by on the horizon. I had built my island. I had fortified it with theory and guarded it with judgment. And now I would live on it, the most ethical person in a world of one. My name is Abby. I am 21. And I have everything I ever wanted, which is the most terrifying thing of all. The inheritance was mine. The victory was mine. The silence was mine. And as the moon rose over the Quinta de la Memoria, I realized that the independent woman I had fought so hard to become was just another way of saying I was someone that nobody could reach. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the smell of the coffee shop, the sound of the steam wand, the feeling of being off the world, however flawed it was. But the memory was fading, replaced by the clinical, sterile scent of my bamboo and solar sanctuary. I had won. I had finally, truly won. And I would spend the rest of my life wondering why winning felt so much like a slow, quiet death. The night stretched on, a vast expanse of political correctness and ethical certainty. I sat in the center of it, a radical icon in an empty frame, waiting for a tomorrow that would look exactly like today. The daily patriarchy report was finished. There were no more entries to make. The labor was over. The ledger was closed. I was Abby. I was right. And I was alone. The villa, once a home of tradition and noise, was now a monument to a single ideology. It stood on the hill, a beacon of purity in a darkened world, containing nothing but a girl and her books and a majority share of a ghost. I lay down on my sustainable mattress and stared at the ceiling. I thought of my grandfather, whose wealth I had redistributed. I thought of my brothers, whose presence I had traded for equity. I thought of the world I had rejected because it wasn't good enough. And in the quiet, I finally understood the ultimate sociological truth, that humans are not meant to be pure. We are meant to be together. But it was a truth I had learned too late, on the wrong side of a courtroom verdict. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep, the only place left where I didn't have to be right. In my dreams, perhaps I could be unconscious again. In my dreams, I could be a family that didn't need an auditor. But for now, in the waking world, I was the owner of the Quinta de la Memoria. And the memory was all I had left. I reached out and turned off the light. The solar batteries would last through the night. They were efficient. They were reliable. They were exactly like me. And they were cold. The end of the story was not a shout or a protest. It was just the sound of a key turning in a lock and the silence that followed. The anatomy of injustice was complete. The diss was over. And there was nothing left on the table but the heart of the person who had performed it. I am Abby. I am 21. And I am the last person left in the world I created. The shadows of the bamboo trees danced on the walls, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that felt like a clock ticking down to nothing. I realized then that my life had become a series of safe choices, a sequence of rejections that had left me with a safe house and a safe bank account, but no safety in the arms of another human being. I had dismantled the patriarchy, but I had also dismantled the bridge that led back to humanity. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I sat up and looked at the library. The books were still there, their spines straight and proud. They were my only friends now. They didn't talk back. They didn't manspread. They didn't have unconscious biases. They were perfect. And they were made of dead trees. I walked to the window and looked out at the path leading to the gate. It was empty. No one was coming to visit. No one was coming to argue. No one was coming to love me. I had won. I had truly, finally won. I picked up my pen one last time and wrote in the margin of my thesis, "The ultimate victory of the individual is the total isolation of the soul." I closed the book. The sun was up now, shining on the solar panels, feeding the house with the energy it needed to stay exactly as it was. I was Abby. I was 21. And I was free. Free from everyone. Free from everything. Free at last, to be nothing at all. The villa stood silent in the morning light, a beautiful, ethical tomb for a girl who had forgotten how to forgive. And as the world outside began its messy, flawed, and beautiful day, I sat in my perfect kitchen and brewed a single cup of fair trade coffee and drank it all by myself. It tasted of nothing. It tasted of the future. It tasted of the price I had paid to be right. I am Abby. And this is my story. The story of a girl who had a majority share of everything and 100% of nothing. I sat there until the coffee went cold, watching the dust motes dance in the light, the only things in the room that were allowed to move without a political justification. They were free. And for a moment, I envied them. Then I stood up, straightened my black turtleneck, and began my daily audit of the silence. It was, as always, perfectly maintained. I had succeeded. I had achieved the ethical purity I had sought. And as I looked at my reflection in the window, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked like a statue. She looked like a monument. She looked like the end of the world. I turned away from the glass and walked into the shadows of the house, my cane tapping a rhythmic, lonely beat on the sustainable bamboo floors. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of a winner. The sound of the only person left in the room. The sound of Abby, 21, sociology student, radical observer, and the richest, poorest person in all of Madrid. I sat down in my chair and waited for the next microaggression of the clock, the next tiny theft of time, as the world moved on without me, leaving me behind in my perfect, righteous, and empty kingdom.